She was deaf, 8 years old, and alone in a blizzard, and when the world went silent, she heard something no one else could: the cry of a wounded dog, trembling and bleeding in the snow. Most would have shut the door, but she opened her arms. What happened next defied logic, instinct, even survival, because this wasn't just a stray, it was a warning, a beginning, and a truth no one saw coming. If you're drawn to stories where love rewrites fate, where a child's touch changes everything, subscribe and stay till the end. You won't believe what these dogs were running from. The wind howled low and constant across the frozen stillness of the Alaskan wilderness, dragging the scent of pine, smoke, and ancient ice across the trees like a forgotten hymn. Snow fell in thick, slanting curtains outside a modest wooden cabin nestled deep in the woods near Juneau. A fresh storm had begun its slow, relentless siege by dusk, piling drifts against the narrow porch and sealing the world in white silence. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and Claire Carter had always liked it that way, until now. Claire was 38, tall and wiry, with long auburn hair usually pulled into a bun that she often forgot to redo. A once promising painter from Portland, she had moved to Alaska 3 years ago after a bitter divorce and a breakdown that ended her gallery contract. Motherhood in the wilderness had softened her edges but didn't dull the flicker of fire behind her sea-glass green eyes. She painted landscapes now quiet, moody canvases of ice fields and moonlit peaks sold through a modest online shop, just enough to keep her and her daughter safe and fed. But she was still haunted by the need to control the chaos around her, a defense mechanism carved from years of emotional abandonment. Inside the cabin, warm firelight flickered against the pine walls. A pot of stew simmered gently on the old wood-burning stove. Claire sat on the braided rug beside her 3-year-old daughter, Sophie, watching the child sort colored blocks in absolute silence. Sophie was born profoundly deaf, a truth discovered months after birth, and accepted by Claire not as a tragedy, but as a gift that reframed the world. Sophie had large, expressive eyes the color of dusk and soft blonde curls that danced when she moved. Though she could not hear, she saw everything, every flicker of emotion, every shadow, every breath. A low creak sounded, followed by the whine of wind through the chink of a window frame. Claire frowned and moved toward the front door, half expecting to see a fallen branch or a drifting pile of snow blocking the path. But when she opened the door, what she found was something else entirely. 2 large dogs stood on the porch, shivering violently, snow clinging to their fur like frost on a dead leaf. One stood tall and alert, a male German shepherd with thick black and tan fur dulled by exposure. He held his head high but limped slightly, one back leg dragging with each shift of weight. His dark eyes met Claire's with a strange intelligence, not wild, not pleading, but aware. The other was a female, smaller and younger, her coat a lighter sable with a faint reddish hue. She pressed close to the male, her breath fogging in short puffs. Her ribs showed faintly beneath her coat, and one of her ears had a jagged tear as if from a long-ago fight. Claire's first instinct was to close the door. Her heart pounded as the logical part of her screamed that these were wild dogs, potentially dangerous, diseased, or desperate. But then Sophie appeared beside her, barefoot on the wooden floor, despite Claire's constant reminders, her small hand tugging gently on her mother's sleeve. The little girl stared at the dogs, unafraid, her head tilted slightly. Claire crouched down and signed quickly. Dogs, they are cold, dangerous. But Sophie didn't seem to understand, or chose not to. She stepped forward onto the threshold, Claire's breath caught. "Sophie," she said, but the girl was already reaching out. The female dog stiffened, her ears flicking forward. Blitz, the male, moved slightly in front of her as if shielding her from danger. But it was not fear Claire saw. It was hesitance, uncertainty. Sophie stood still, just inside the boundary of the porch, her small hand outstretched. Then, in one slow motion, the female dog stepped forward. Not to growl, not to sniff aggressively, but to gently nuzzle Sophie's hand with her nose. Sophie giggled silently, her shoulders shaking, and turned to look at Claire with a wide, triumphant grin. And in that moment, everything changed. Claire's resolve melted like snow on firewood. She opened the door wider and stepped aside. "Only the porch," she said aloud, to herself more than to them. But the dogs didn't try to enter. They simply collapsed in a heap near the door, Blitz curling protectively around the female. Up close, Claire saw blood seeping from a wound on his leg, dried and cracked. She stepped back inside, closing the door halfway, heart hammering. She didn't know why they were here. She didn't know if they belonged to someone or if they had run from something, but something about the way the female dog looked at Sophie. Steady, soft, knowing felt, like more than coincidence. Sophie curled up by the door, nose against the glass, watching them with an expression Claire had never seen before. It wasn't fascination. It was recognition. Claire sighed and crossed the room to retrieve an old wool blanket from the storage bench. She opened the door again and stepped out into the howling wind. Blitz stirred but didn't rise. Claire laid the blanket gently over them both. The female licked her hand once, briefly, before resting her head on Blitz's side. "You can stay," Claire said softly, almost in disbelief at her own voice. "But just for tonight." Inside, she locked the door behind her, heart full of questions and a feeling she hadn't felt in years, the beginning of something larger than herself. Outside, the wind wailed like some ancient spirit, but for the first time in many winters, Claire didn't feel entirely alone. The wind had quieted by morning, but the snow had not. Flakes drifted thick and slow across the sky like ash from some celestial fire, blanketing everything in a hush that made even thought feel like an intrusion. Claire stood by the window of the cabin, holding a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee, staring out toward the old shed that sat crookedly at the edge of the clearing. Through the warped glass, she could just make out the faint outline of two canine forms curled in the lee of the building, the wool blanket now crusted with ice and half covered in snow. She sighed, set her mug down, and bundled herself in her heavy canvas coat, the one patched at the elbows and smelling faintly of turpentine and pine sap. Claire had always lived somewhere between reluctant kindness and pragmatic caution, but something about last night still throbbed in her bones. Not fear, not exactly. Something closer to knowing. The dogs hadn't barked once, not at her, not at the wind, not at each other. She stepped outside into the soft groan of the porch boards, pulling her scarf tight around her neck. Sophie was already up, sitting cross-legged by the fire, sketching something in crayon. Claire hadn't needed to wake her. Her daughter always seemed to rise with the faintest flicker of daylight, as if drawn toward the sun, even without hearing its morning sounds. Claire had left Sophie inside with a plate of sliced pears and a pencil box, hoping the silence would stretch long enough to think clearly. When Claire reached the shed, she hesitated. It was little more than a timber-framed lean-to with a slanted metal roof and broken latch. Inside were gardening tools, paint supplies, a rusted generator she hadn't used since the first year. She had swept a corner clean the night before, laid a pile of old moving blankets, and opened the door wide. If they had wanted to leave, they could have. But they hadn't. She eased the door open again. The two dogs stirred but didn't rise. The male, whom she'd mentally nicknamed Blitz for the streaks of black fur across his shoulders, blinked slowly, his ears swiveling, but his posture neutral. The female, lighter and slighter, lifted her head just enough to rest her muzzle across her front paws. Her eyes, wide and gold-flecked, locked with Claire's. And in that gaze, Claire saw something disturbingly familiar. Not a plea, not submission, but recognition. As if she were not a stranger, but something remembered. "You two planning to stay?" Claire whispered, crouching to their level. "Or are you just passing through and happened to pick the right porch?" The female, Nova, as Sophie had already begun calling her, didn't respond. But she didn't look away either. Claire examined Blitz more closely. His leg was swollen now, the fur matted with dried blood and something darker beneath. Infection, maybe. She reached slowly into her coat and pulled out a small Tupperware container of chicken broth and rice. At the sound, Nova rose first, tail still, eyes watching, and nose the air. Blitz shifted but did not approach. Claire set the food down between them and stepped back. As Nova began eating slowly, with deliberate restraint, Claire finally allowed herself to exhale. She'd known fear before, in hospitals, in courtrooms, in the middle of icy roads at night, with a toddler in the back seat. But this was not fear. This was a question, growing larger. Back inside, Sophie had abandoned her crayon drawing in favor of something stranger. She was arranging objects on the floor, a wooden spoon, a blue marble, her mittens, and one of Claire's old scarves. When Claire leaned closer, she realized the pattern was symmetrical, almost ceremonial. Sophie pointed toward the door and signed, "Them, it's for them." Claire knelt beside her. "What is it for?" She signed gently. Sophie just smiled and patted the scarf, then made the sign for safe. Later that afternoon, the snow let up enough for Claire to walk Sophie to the edge of the woods behind the house. They didn't go far, just to the old firewood pile where the snow wasn't as deep. She had dressed Sophie in the puffiest coat the girl would tolerate and a hand-knitted hat with little fox ears. The dogs trailed behind at a distance, not close enough to threaten, not far enough to flee. Nova was the first to close the gap. She approached Sophie slowly, step by step, never looking directly at her. When she finally sat, it was less a dog's pose than a guardian's vigil. Sophie reached out again and laid a mittened hand against the side of Nova's neck. The dog didn't flinch. Claire watched this unfold with a silent mixture of awe and suspicion. She had grown up with dogs retrievers, mostly gentle, loyal things who needed approval and feared thunderstorms. But Blitz and Nova carried themselves like sentries, like ghosts. They were not hungry for food, they were hungry for purpose, or refuge. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, curled in her blanket forts of pillows and picture books, Claire sat by the fire with her sketch pad. She hadn't drawn for herself in months. The first thing her pencil did, almost unconsciously, was outline the eyes she couldn't forget. Nova's watching Sophie, not wild, not domestic, something in between, something older. Halfway through shading, a knock-no, a scratch sounded at the door. Claire froze. The dogs hadn't entered the house all day, but now the female was there again. Claire opened the door cautiously. Nova stood on the threshold, not stepping in, just looking past Claire into the room, then glancing toward the hallway toward Sophie's room. Claire stepped aside. Nova entered silently and laid down at the edge of the hallway rug. She did not bark. She did not move. Just watched the shadows flicker along the wall as if standing guard. Claire didn't stop her. In the shed, Blitz remained alone. The next morning broke cold and brittle, with sunlight glinting off every surface like shards of shattered glass. The sky had cleared into a high, pale dome, and the silence outside was so complete it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Claire stepped out onto the porch wrapped in a flannel robe, her boots crunching through the top layer of crusted snow. She clutched a steaming cup of tea, but her eyes were already scanning for them, Blitz and Nova. Nova, ever watchful, was already awake, lying under the overhang near the shed, her head lifted at Claire's approach. Blitz, however, remained inside the shed. Claire hadn't seen him eat since yesterday afternoon. The broth and rice had barely been touched, and though he hadn't growled or backed away, his movements had become slower, more deliberate. She knew infection when she saw it. Kneeling beside him with a careful kind of reverence, she finally peeled back the fur around his injured leg and gasped. Lodged deep in the flesh, beneath layers of dried blood and irritated skin, was a fragment of metal jagged, stained with rust. It gleamed faintly in the light, just enough to reveal something else etched on its edge, a serial number. Blitz didn't growl. He simply looked at her with that same steady gaze as she leaned closer. Claire swallowed hard, stood, and hurried back inside. She booted up the old laptop she kept in the corner of the cabin normally reserved for email, art orders, and the occasional Skype call with her sister in Montana. Now she searched military canine IDs and injury tags, her fingers shaking slightly as she typed. It didn't take long. The code on the fragment matched a registry from a decade-old military project, a K9 handler program designed for remote surveillance and protection. Most of the dogs had been declared retired or relocated after the program was defunded 5 years earlier. Claire stared at the faded photo on the screen. It showed Blitz, unmistakable even in the younger years, taller, prouder, with dark fur unmarred by scars. His eyes were the same, intelligent, sharp, and haunted. The accompanying report was brief. Deemed missing in field incident, presumed lost. She leaned back in her chair, stunned. Lost. Not dead, not retired. Lost. The idea that this animal had been wandering alone for years was hard enough to process, but he hadn't been alone. Nova had been with him. She had cared for him, protected him. Claire felt that truth rise in her chest like a wave. Nova wasn't just a stray companion. She had chosen to stay. Outside, Sophie sat cross-legged near the hearth with a fresh sheet of paper in front of her. Her fingers moved quickly, decisively, dragging crayons across the page with more intent than usual. Claire watched from the kitchen doorway, quietly. The girl had been unusually focused that morning, saying nothing, signing nothing, just drawing. When Sophie finally turned the paper toward her mother, Claire nearly dropped the mug in her hand. It was a crude sketch, but unmistakable. A cabin, 2 large dogs, and a small figure with long hair standing between them, one hand outstretched to each animal. The proportions were strange. Sophie had made the dogs nearly as tall as the cabin, their eyes large and bright, almost human. Claire signed gently. "What is this, sweetheart?" Sophie pointed at the small figure and then to herself. Then she pointed to the 2 dogs and signed, "Family." Claire's throat tightened. "How do you know?" she whispered aloud, the sound barely carrying past her lips. Sophie only smiled, tilting her head. She reached into the crayon box again and began adding something to the sky golden streaks like sunbeams, though the scene was clearly at night. Claire didn't understand the meaning, but she didn't press. The drawing felt like something sacred. Later that day, as the sun moved low behind the snow-draped pines, Claire returned to the shed with warm water, gauze, and a tube of antibiotic ointment she'd kept since Sophie had sliced her hand on a pine branch 2 summers ago. Blitz was lying down again, and his breathing had grown heavier, more strained. Nova, who had been resting nearby, rose and stood between Claire and Blitz. Not with aggression, but caution. Claire knelt down, holding up her hands. "I just want to help," she said softly, voice trembling with the weight of what felt like a fragile ritual. "Please." Nova studied her, then slowly stepped aside. Claire cleaned the wound with care, dabbing gently where the blood pooled. Blitz didn't flinch. When she finally worked the metal shard free with a pair of tweezers, the dog tensed but didn't cry out. Claire dropped the piece into a tin bowl. It landed with a hard clink that echoed inside the shed like a warning bell. She treated the area, wrapped it tight, and sat back on her heels, breathless. "Whatever you went through," she murmured to Blitz, "you survived it. You came all this way for something." The dogs didn't respond, but Nova moved closer and gently licked at Blitz's ears. It was the first time Claire had seen either of them show anything like affection. That evening, as the fire cracked and Sophie lay asleep, curled beneath a quilt sewn by her grandmother, Claire picked up the metal shard and examined it again. It felt strangely heavy in her palm, not just from weight, but from memory. She placed it gently on the shelf above her desk and returned to her sketch pad. This time, she didn't draw the dogs. She drew a map, not of trails or rivers, but of connections. Herself, Sophie, Nova, and Blitz 4, points on a path that none of them had chosen, yet all of them now walked together. Outside, the moon rose silver and slow. The forest held its breath once more. The wind had softened by evening, brushing the treetops with a whisper rather than a howl. Claire sat by the window, a mug of peppermint tea cupped in her hands, watching the final orange ribbons of daylight stretch and vanish behind the pines. Sophie was asleep early, curled into her blanket cocoon, after a day spent stacking stones into curious spirals near the woods, her imagination speaking where her voice could not. Blitz and Nova had been quiet all day, sleeping in shifts near the shed. But as darkness fell, something changed. At first it was Nova ears suddenly upright, body rigid. She stood at the door to the mudroom, tail stiff, emitting a low growl that quickly turned into a short, sharp bark, unlike any Claire had heard from her before. Blitz followed a second later, hobbling slightly on his healing leg, but unmistakably alert. His paw slammed twice against the door, not in panic, in insistence. Claire opened the door without question. Nova darted out first, her paws barely disturbing the crust of snow. Blitz followed, slower but determined. Claire didn't hesitate. She threw on her long wool coat, yanked on her boots, and grabbed the flashlight from the hook. The air outside bit deep into her cheeks, but the adrenaline dulled its sting. The dogs were already moving toward the woods behind the cabin, along the same narrow path Claire often used to fetch kindling. They moved fast, but not wildly, pausing often to ensure she kept up. It wasn't a chase, it was a guide, a mission. They reached a clearing where the trees thinned and the snow deepened. The beam of Claire's flashlight flicked across drifts that rose nearly to her knees. Then, Nova let out a noise Claire had never heard, a high-pitched, keening yelp that trembled with urgency. Blitz moved to a mound just beyond a cluster of broken shrubs, pawing at the surface with frantic energy. Claire rushed forward. She dropped to her knees beside them and began scooping snow away with her bare hands, the flashlight slipping from her grip. Beneath the powder, something stirred. A whimper. A soft, desperate sound. Claire gasped, shoving harder now, uncovering a small body, trembling, half buried. A pup. German shepherd. Fur soaked, eyes glazed with exhaustion, but alive. Its legs kicked weakly as Claire freed it from the snowpack, its ribs too visible under the thin layer of fur. Its ears were barely beginning to stand, and its nose was crusted with ice. She pulled it close to her chest without thinking, wrapping her coat around its fragile frame. The pup whimpered once more, and then fell still, trusting. Nova circled them, nose pressed to the pup's head, licking its ears. Her entire body vibrated with something that felt beyond instinct. Blitz stood guard beside them, scanning the woods, body tense but unshaking. Claire looked at Nova and suddenly understood. "This is yours," she whispered. Nova met her gaze, and there was no doubt. They returned to the cabin with care, Claire carrying the pup bundled in her coat like a newborn. Inside, she lit the fireplace higher, laid a towel by the hearth, and gently placed the tiny dog on it. Sophie, roused by the commotion, appeared in the hallway rubbing her eyes. She saw the puppy, then looked at Nova and back at her mother. She signed one word. "Baby?" Claire nodded. "Yes, I think so." Sophie crept forward and knelt beside the pup. Nova lay beside them, resting her head next to the puppy's paws, licking it slowly, reassuringly. The pup stirred faintly in response, letting out a sigh. Claire fetched warm broth in a syringe, feeding the pup drop by drop until it could keep its head up. It drank weakly, but it drank. That night, Claire didn't sleep. She sat by the fire with the puppy against her chest while Nova lay at her feet and Blitz kept watch by the window. In that flickering quiet, the truth settled over her like falling snow. This wasn't just about rescue. This wasn't chance. Blitz and Nova hadn't come seeking shelter. They had come seeking safety. For this pup. And somehow, in some way Claire couldn't explain, they had known where to find it. In the morning, the sky was a pale blue, the kind of winter morning that hums with stillness. The pup was stronger. It sat up on wobbly legs, sniffing the air, tail twitching. Claire sat with Sophie on the rug as the girl drew the family again. Nova, Blitz, the baby pup, and herself. This time, she drew Claire in the center too. She tapped the drawing with her finger and signed, "Pack." Claire looked from the child to the dogs Nova, watching them with a mother's calm. Blitz, still standing guard by the door. She understood now. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a calling, a story older than logic. The snow hadn't fallen in 3 days, and that in itself was unsettling. In the heart of an Alaskan winter, stillness could mean danger. Claire noticed it first while collecting firewood from behind the shed. A ring of snow had melted slightly around the structure where the dogs often slept. But outside that space, near the tree line, something was off. She crouched and ran her gloved fingers lightly across a patch where the powder had been disturbed. The prints were too deep for animal tracks. Boot marks, large, heavy, recent. She stood up, eyes sweeping the tree line, but the world around her remained hushed, almost too calm. Her breath caught as Nova appeared beside her, silent as shadow. The dog's ears were pricked forward, her body tense. Blitz, still recovering from the wound on his leg, remained in the shed, but had grown increasingly alert over the past day. Any time a branch cracked or a bird flew too low, his body stiffened, his gaze sweeping for threats. Claire went inside with the firewood, trying to keep her steps steady. Sophie was in the living room, drawing again, but this time not with crayons. She had discovered charcoal sticks from one of Claire's old art boxes, and was now smudging dark arcs across thick sketch paper. The result was raw, almost primitive. Tall trees, a cabin, and a figure, small, black, standing alone just beyond the trees. When Claire leaned in, Sophie tapped the figure twice and signed, "Watch." Claire's voice was thin. "Where did you see this?" Sophie just shrugged and kept drawing. Claire didn't sleep much that night. She sat by the fire in a flannel shirt and jeans, arms folded tightly, a flashlight and her father's old hunting knife close at hand. She told herself she was being paranoid, letting the wild feed her imagination. But something deeper, something primal, said otherwise. The next morning was colder than any yet that winter. The thermometer nailed beside the porch window read 14 degrees Celsius. Everything outside was frozen solid, the kind of cold that turned breath into needles and trees into brittle bones. She stepped out early, just before sunrise, and found Nova already waiting. Blitz limped out behind her, looking stronger than before, but still careful with his step. He sniffed the air and growled low in his throat, a deep warning sound Claire hadn't heard before. Then the man came. It was just past noon when a truck crunched its way up the snow-covered path. An old Dodge, faded green, with chains wrapped around the tires. Claire watched from the window, tension climbing into her chest like ice in her lungs. Sophie stood beside her, clinging to her sleeve. Blitz and Nova were already at the edge of the porch, bodies taut, heads low. The man who stepped out looked like someone who had spent too much time running from something. He was tall, broad-shouldered, mid-50s maybe, with a sharp nose and pale eyes that didn't seem to blink enough. His beard was patchy and mostly gray, and he wore a long, waxed canvas coat stained with oil. He walked with a casual, almost arrogant swagger that set Claire immediately on edge. He knocked once, then stood back. Claire opened the door, only partway. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Heard someone around here found a German shepherd. Big one. Black markings. That yours?" He gestured toward Blitz, who was now standing directly behind Claire, staring hard at the stranger. "I found 2 dogs," Claire replied, voice flat. "They came to me during a storm." The man nodded slowly, eyes still locked on Blitz. "That boy's mine. Name's Tank, not Blitz. Trained him myself, military bred. Lost him during a transport 2 winters ago. Didn't think I'd see him again." Claire's hand tightened on the edge of the door. "You lost him?" "Yeah, well, things happen. Crate busted during an accident. Thought he froze or got eaten out there, but here he is." He stepped forward, reaching past her without asking. "Come on, Tank, time to go." Blitz didn't move. Instead, he lowered his head and growled a deep guttural sound that vibrated through the wooden floor. Claire held her ground. The man blinked, surprised. "Ha, guess he's forgotten his place." Claire didn't respond. Instead, she stepped fully into the doorway, blocking his view of the cabin interior. "If you're claiming ownership, you'll need paperwork, ID, vet records, anything." The man's eyes narrowed. "Lady, I don't need to prove anything to you. That dog's mine. You have no right to keep him. And you don't have the right to take him without proof." A silence fell between them, not the silence of strangers, but of challenge. Outside, Nova moved closer to the porch, placing herself between Claire and the truck. "You know," the man said slowly, stepping back, "I always figured if that dog turned on someone, it wouldn't be me. But maybe a few years with strays and hippies changes things." Claire's voice was ice. "He didn't turn on you, he remembered." That was when Blitz stepped forward. With quiet determination, he walked beside Claire, his eyes never leaving the man. He stopped at the top step, sat, and lifted his head high. Then he let out a bark, one sharp, deliberate sound. Not fear, not threat. Declaration. The man stared for another moment, then turned and spat into the snow. "This isn't over," he muttered, climbing into his truck. Claire watched until the vehicle disappeared into the trees. Only then did she shut the door and lean back against it, heart racing. Sophie stood nearby, watching everything in silence. She signed softly, "Bad man, Blitz knows." Claire nodded slowly. "Yes, he does." That night, the cabin felt different. The wind picked up again, but the warmth inside held. Claire lit an extra candle on the windowsill. It was something her grandmother used to do, to keep away whatever darkness tried to come in. Blitz lay near the fire, Nova curled around Sophie's blanket nest. Outside, in the shed, the snow began to fall again, softly covering the strange footprints near the tree line. The snow came again that night, as if trying to erase everything that had happened. It fell heavy and slow, piling in mounds along the porch railing and gathering in the seams of the cabin roof. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Blitz hadn't moved from his spot by the fireplace since the stranger left. Nova paced the perimeter of the cabin, sniffing under windows and occasionally growling low under her breath, a guardian unable to sleep. Claire barely touched her dinner. She sat in the corner chair with her laptop balanced on her knees, its glow flickering across her tired face. Sophie was curled up in the blanket nest near the fire, thumb tucked in her mouth, already asleep. Claire glanced over at her daughter, then back to the collar she held in her hand, the one Blitz had worn since his arrival. It was old and frayed, the leather worn down to suede near the buckle. A small metal tag was attached under the inner lining, likely missed by whoever last handled it. Claire had only discovered it by accident while cleaning the fur around Blitz's neck earlier that day. The number stamped into the steel was small and faint, MWD792H. Claire typed the code into the search bar, her fingers stiff from cold and anxiety. It didn't take long before something came up, a declassified registry from a former U.S. military program involving multi-use working dogs. According to the file, Blitz's full designation had been MWD Blitz, handler code H2, status MIA, date 3 years ago. She scrolled further. Blitz had been part of a covert K-9 unit used for specialized missions in high-risk zones. The last known record detailed a rescue operation gone wrong during a domestic protection assignment, where the convoy was ambushed by armed gunmen. The handler was killed in the chaos. Blitz had reportedly shielded a civilian child from gunfire, sustaining injury before disappearing during the aftermath. No one had found his body. He had been declared lost. Claire sat frozen. Her heart ached. This dog, this silent, watchful creature, hadn't just wandered into her life. He had survived violence, grief, abandonment. He had carried all that history in his bones, and yet he still chose to protect. She took a breath and opened a new tab. This time, she visited the Military Working Dog Rescue Initiative, a non-profit Claire had read about in passing months earlier while researching animal trauma and rehabilitation. She filled out the form, location, findings, ID number, current condition. Then she paused at the last question. Why do you believe this dog is MWD792H? Claire typed, because he still protects, even when no one asked him to. She hit submit. The reply came faster than expected within the hour. A woman named Rachel Myers responded. Her message was short, but full of urgency. Rachel introduced herself as a former K-9 handler and now coordinator with the rescue group. She had shoulder-length dark hair in her profile photo, with eyes that looked tired but sharp. Claire read the message aloud quietly. I've been searching for Blitz for 3 years. He was last seen outside a facility in Montana during a protection operation. Everything went wrong. He went missing after pulling a 5-year-old boy from a hail of bullets. That child lived. Blitz vanished. No one believed he made it through the storm. We thought he died out there. If this is him, I need to speak with you. Claire stared at the message, her thoughts spinning. A 5-year-old boy. Blitz had saved a child before, and now he had found his way to Sophie. Claire looked at her daughter, who stirred slightly in her sleep, the firelight glowing softly on her curls. It was no longer coincidence. Nova and Blitz hadn't just stumbled upon the cabin. They had come here with a purpose. And Sophie, she had chosen them without hesitation. The way only children could, sensing something beyond speech. The next morning, Claire scheduled a video call with Rachel. When the screen flickered to life, Claire saw a woman in her early 40s, with a lean, muscular build and calm, serious energy. Rachel's voice was steady but filled with emotion as she spoke. That's him, she said the moment Blitz appeared behind Claire, his head turning slightly at the sound of Rachel's voice. I'd know him anywhere. The eyes, they never change. Claire told her everything. How he arrived with Nova, how he never barked, how he stayed close to Sophie like he understood her silence. Rachel listened, occasionally nodding, her hands clasped tightly together. Blitz was special, Rachel said. He was trained to detect threats, sure, but what made him different was his intuition. He'd ignore orders if he sensed something deeper. He once led us off route by 3 miles because he refused to go down. A path, turned out there was a buried explosive. He saved our lives more than once. But after that last mission, after what he saw, we think something broke. Or maybe opened. And Nova? Claire asked. Rachel shook her head. She wasn't in the registry. She must have found him after. Dogs like Blitz, when they go rogue, they don't usually survive long. Maybe she became his pack, his anchor. Claire nodded slowly. They're not leaving her either. Blitz watches Sophie, but Nova. Nova sleeps outside her room like she's guarding her dreams. Rachel smiled faintly. They're a unit now. You, your daughter, them. I can't explain it, but it's real. After the call, Claire felt something settle in her chest. Not closure, not yet, but a kind of clarity. She stepped outside with a blanket and a fresh bowl of warm broth, placing them beside the shed where Blitz was resting. Nova padded up beside her, watching quietly. Claire knelt beside Blitz and stroked his back. You saved someone before, didn't you? She murmured. And now you're trying to save someone again. I think I finally understand. Blitz didn't move, but his breathing eased, his body relaxing against the cold earth. That evening, Sophie stood by the door, watching the snow begin again. She turned and signed, They stay. This is home. Claire looked at her daughter, then out at the two dogs lying close together beneath the falling snow. She felt something shift in the air, less like an ending, more like a beginning. The storm arrived without warning, swift and savage, riding in on a front of white fury that swallowed the horizon by noon. Claire had been outside earlier that morning, gathering firewood with Blitz at her side, and Nova close to Sophie, who was playfully collecting pine cones and stacking them like little towers. The sky had been overcast, but not threatening. Yet by mid-afternoon, the wind screamed through the trees like a chorus of wolves, and snow fell in sheets so dense they erased every shape beyond 20 feet. Inside the cabin, Claire paced near the window, biting her lip, phone in hand. The call from the rescue organization still rang in her ears. Rachel Myers, calm and resolute, had explained that Blitz and Nova were being requested for re-evaluation at a recovery center 2 states away, part of a formal policy whenever a military-trained dog was confirmed alive after years missing. Nova, though unofficial, would have to come too for behavioral testing and health screening. They'll be treated with care, Rachel had assured. But this decision's not up to us. We're legally bound. Claire had tried to reason with her. You didn't see what they've done here. They're part of this family now. Especially Sophie, she changed because of them. But Rachel's tone was firm. I understand more than you know, but if you want to keep them, you'll need to fight through the proper channels. Claire looked over at Sophie, who had curled into Nova's side on the rug, holding the little pup now, named Echo, who had begun to walk again, legs still wobbly, but growing stronger each day. Blitz stood by the window, as if waiting for something. Later that night, when the wind grew too loud to ignore, Sophie had wandered from her blanket nest while Claire was stoking the fire. She slipped on her boots and coat, hastily, clumsily, and opened the back door, chasing after something only she had seen, a fluttering scrap of fabric or the shadow of a fox. Whatever it was, it pulled her just past the trees where the ground dropped into an old ravine. By the time Claire noticed the door ajar and the paw prints in the snow, her screams split the night. Blitz growled once and bolted out, but Nova was faster. She vanished into the dark, her body a blur of motion against the white. Claire followed blindly, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Her lungs burned, her boots skidding on hidden ice, heart hammering with images of Sophie alone, cold, lost. Then she heard it. A bark, sharp and frantic, and another, more urgent, deeper, Nova's. Claire sprinted toward the sound and nearly fell to her knees at the edge of the ravine. Sophie dangled by her arms from a lip of snow, boots kicking weakly against the frozen edge. Nova stood above her, gripping the girl's jacket with her teeth, holding steady with trembling legs. Claire didn't think. She dropped to the ground, reached out, grabbed Sophie's wrists, and pulled. With one heave, she brought her daughter up and into her arms, sobbing into her hair, as Nova finally let go, panting, body shaking from strain. Blitz stood behind them, barking toward the woods, alerting, perhaps warning, but not afraid. The next morning, news of the storm's drama spread faster than Claire would have imagined. It turned out one of the search and rescue volunteers, Jackson Hayes, a local forestry worker, an amateur tracker, had seen Claire running through the snow and followed her trail from afar. Jackson was in his early 40s, tall with a lumbering gait and kind eyes that always seemed to carry quiet stories. He was the kind of man who rarely spoke unless it mattered and whose word carried weight in town. He told the town council what he saw. That dog, Nova, saved the girl's life. No hesitation. She clung to that child like her own. Word traveled fast in a town where everyone knew everyone. And when the military rescue team returned 2 days later to collect Blitz and Nova, they didn't expect to be met with resistance. Jackson stood with Claire, So did Anna Lorne, the town's only nurse practitioner in her 50s, silver braid and tough-as-nails demeanor. She had once nursed a bear cub back to health in her garage and wasn't afraid of government forms. "They belong here," Anna said simply. "You remove them, you break something that doesn't get fixed." Rachel arrived in person this time. She wore a field jacket, jeans, and the strained look of someone caught between duty and heart. She spent an hour with Claire, watching Sophie play beside the dogs, watching Nova nuzzle Echo and Blitz follow Sophie like a silent guardian. Rachel's resolve softened visibly. She called her director. They argued. Then she made a counteroffer. "We'll draft a guardianship agreement," she said at last. "You'll be their legal custodian, but you'll need to agree to health checks, behavioral reports, and proper housing standards." Claire nodded through tears. "I'll build a shelter if I have to. I'll do whatever they need." Rachel smiled, exhausted but sincere. Then they stay. That night, as the snow began to melt in gentle patches, Claire stood on the porch while Sophie slept, curled up in Nova's belly. Echo snoozed by the hearth. Blitz sat beside her, silent, watching the stars. For the first time in years, Claire felt the border blur between human and animal, fear and trust, loss and home, and she no longer saw them as strays. They were hers. The snow melted in slow sighs, revealing patches of earth that drank in the thaw like a long-awaited promise. Pine needles reappeared from under thick white carpets. The first buds emerged stubbornly on the birch trees that lined the edge of the property, and with them came the subtle stirrings of change. The cabin, once a quiet retreat wrapped in solitude, now hummed with soft energy. A new sign hung on the fence, Solstead Haven. Beneath it, smaller hand-painted letters read, "A shelter for those who protect." It wasn't official, not by the town's standards, but it didn't need to be. The townspeople knew where to go when they found a lost dog trembling on the roadside, or when someone couldn't care for their aging companion. Claire's porch light became a symbol, and beside that light, Blitz and Nova were always watching. Claire had changed. Her face still held the weariness of years past, but now it was tempered with something else. Peace. She had traded long hours of grief and survival for slow mornings with coffee and paint. Her easel stood in a converted corner of the cabin, where morning light fell in golden slants. Her hands, once trembling from the cold of loneliness, now worked steadily, translating moments into brush strokes. Her new studio, just a modest wooden structure built with Jackson's help, was filled with canvas after canvas of animal eyes, forests, snowstorms, and one recurring image: 2 German shepherds and a little girl, silhouetted against an endless sky. Local visitors wandered in often. Tourists from nearby towns started arriving too, drawn by the quiet power in Claire's art. Sophie had grown in ways that couldn't be measured in inches. Her hearing hadn't changed. Silence still wrapped her in its strange embrace, but she no longer seemed alone in it. She had found language beyond sound. Her hands moved fluently in signs, her sketches now layered with meaning. Echo, the once shivering pup, had grown into a lanky adolescent with eyes too wise for his months. He followed Sophie everywhere, tail swaying like a banner of joy. Blitz, ever watchful, had taken a more leisurely role in the pack's dynamics. At nearly 9 years old, his face showed grays around the muzzle, and one of his hind legs still carried a slight limp. But he wore his age like armor calm, grounded, steady. Nova remained as intuitive as ever, her loyalty matched only by her sensitivity. She still lay closest to Sophie each night and was the first to sense if Claire stirred in restless dreams. One morning, in late March, after a night of steady rainfall, Claire stepped outside and found Nova sitting silently at the edge of the porch. The air was damp and sweet, and the sun had just begun warming the earth. At Nova's feet lay a small piece of polished wood. Claire knelt beside her, blinking back tears before she even picked it up. The carving was primitive but deeply intentional. A tiny cabin, a girl, 2 dogs. Around them, a crude heart etched like a signature. Claire held the piece close, understanding it not as art, but as offering. A thank you, a symbol of knowing. She didn't know how Nova had done it, whether her teeth had held the knife in some moment of canine genius, or whether Sophie had helped. But it didn't matter. The meaning was clear. This was their home, all of them, and that mattered more than biology, species, or past. Later that week, a woman named Teresa Knoll arrived with a trembling beagle named Mabel. Teresa, in her early 50s, wore a bright red parka and had the kind of face that seemed carved by both kindness and grief. Her eyes crinkled when she smiled, but they rarely did. She had recently lost her son in a car accident and had found Mabel wandering along the highway days later, alone, collarless, bleeding from the ear. Teresa hadn't known what to do until she heard from Anna about Solstead Haven. Claire welcomed her like a neighbor long lost. She showed Teresa the warmth of the fire, the food bowls lined in a row, and the painted canvas on the wall of 3 shadows beneath a sky of stars. Mabel settled in, quickly no, longer shaking by day 3, and by day 5, found curled against Echo in a nest of old quilts, and in that rhythm the haven found its own heartbeat. Sophie painted now too. One of her newest drawings, still clumsy in line but rich in soul, showed Claire with outstretched arms and 4 dogs gathered at her feet, with herself standing just beyond them, smiling. She had drawn a faint trail behind the figures, a winding path through the trees, as if marking where they had come from. Jackson still visited always unannounced. He brought supplies, sometimes wood, sometimes a loaf of bread, once a small metal bell he'd found in his grandfather's shed. "You hang it by the door," he explained, "for when someone arrives you don't hear. Let them ring it." His smile was crooked but warm, like snow just starting to melt. Claire took the bell, nailed it to the porch beam, and every evening, as Sophie watched the sunset with Echo at her feet and Nova pressed against her side, Claire would stand in that doorway and listen, not just for sound, but for presence. She had stopped waiting for silence to end. She had stopped fearing the snow. In its place, she found something quieter, deeper, a communion. This family, however strange, had rewritten what the word meant. No longer bound by names or forms, but by action, by rescue, by love. And in the light of that first full spring, the world no longer looked so cold. The greatest lesson from this story is simple yet unforgettable. Real family is built not only by who we are born to, but by who chooses to stand beside us when it matters most. In everyday life, we often miss the quiet calls for help, the lonely child, the frightened animal, the person who seems fine but is silently struggling. But one act of compassion, one moment of trust can change everything. If this story touched your heart, please like the video. Share it with someone who needs to see it, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. And we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever opened your heart to a stranger, human or animal, and been changed forever? Let us know below.